The heavy rhythmic strike of worn leather boots against imported Italian marble echoed like a gavel in a silent courtroom. It was a harsh, unforgiving sound that immediately shattered the delicate ambient hum of the dining room. The air inside the restaurant was artificially chilled, carrying the faint, intoxicating aroma of white truffles, roasted bone marrow, and the kind of expensive perfume that cost more than a ranch hand made in a month. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a fractured golden light over tables draped in heavy white linen. This was a sanctuary of excess, a fortress built for the elite, where the clinking of champagne flutes served as the soundtrack to billion-dollar deals and shallow conversations. Then the doors opened, and the music of that high society seemed to violently stop. He stepped across the threshold, carrying the weight of a long, dusty day on his shoulders. He wore faded blue jeans that had seen the rough side of a saddle, a simple pearl snap button-down shirt, and a belt buckle that held no diamonds but carried the quiet dignity of hard work. In his calloused hands he respectfully held a silver-belly Stetson hat, its brim slightly weathered from years of blocking the unforgiving Texas sun. His hair was silvering at the temples, his face lined with the kind of profound wisdom that only comes from decades spent listening to the wind sweep across the plains. He did not look like he belonged among the silk ties and designer dresses. To the patrons turning their heads in shock, he looked like a trespasser, an unwelcome reminder of the dirt and sweat upon which their pristine world was built. The collective gaze of the room fell upon him sharp and judging. It was the visual collision of two entirely different universes, the raw, honest reality of the Texas soil crashing head-on into the sterile arrogance of modern luxury. He was not there to make a statement. George was a man who preferred the quiet solitude of his porch, the smell of impending rain over the brush, and the honest labor of tending to his land. But tonight carried a heavy, melancholic purpose. A week prior, he had buried an old friend, a man named Elias, who had worked alongside him for 30 years. Elias was a simple man who had spent his entire life saving pennies, talking endlessly about one day visiting the city to eat at the finest restaurant in the state. He had kept a crumpled magazine clipping of this very establishment pinned to the visor of his pickup truck. Elias never made it, and so George made the long drive from the ranch, trading the familiar comfort of the open highway for the suffocating concrete of the city to honor a promise to a ghost. He wanted nothing more than a quiet meal, a moment of reflection, and a glass of water raised in memory of a good man. The foyer of the restaurant was guarded by a maitre d' named Vincent, a man whose posture was so rigidly upright he appeared to be suspended by invisible wires. Vincent made his living by assessing the net worth of a human being within 3 seconds of them walking through the door. His eyes darted toward the entrance, widening in sheer disbelief as George approached the podium. Vincent looked at the scuffed leather of the boots, the faded denim, the absolute lack of any recognizable designer label. A cold, cynical smile crept across his perfectly manicured face. To Vincent, this man was a mistake, a lost traveler who had wandered too far from a roadside diner. George stopped at the podium. He offered a polite nod, his voice low, steady, and carrying the natural gravel of a man who spoke more to horses than to high society. "Good evening, sir. I have a reservation under Strait." Vincent did not immediately look down at his leather-bound reservation book. Instead, he let the silence stretch a calculated tactic designed to make the intruder feel small. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with honeyed condescension. "I'm afraid, sir, that there must be some sort of confusion. This is a highly exclusive dining room. We maintain a certain standard of decorum here. While we do not have a strictly enforced dress code printed on the door, it is generally understood by our clientele that a certain level of elegance is required. Perhaps there is a more suitable establishment down the street that might accommodate your current attire." George did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He simply held his hat in front of him, his posture unbroken. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen this kind of prejudice before, the ugly sneer of those who believed a man's worth was stitched into the fabric of his coat. He thought of Elias, of the calluses on his friend's hands, and a quiet resolve settled over him. "I understand your concern," Sir George said softly, the Texas drawl thick and polite. "But I made this reservation 2 months ago. It has been confirmed. I just need a table for one. I will not cause you any trouble." Vincent finally lowered his eyes to the book, tracing a manicured finger down the list of names. His jaw tightened when he saw the name clearly printed at 8 o'clock. He could not legally refuse service without causing a scene, and a scene was the one thing he despised more than the man standing in front of him. "Very well," Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its fake warmth. "Right this way." The walk through the dining room felt like a march through a hostile canyon. Vincent did not lead him to the center of the room, where the prominent guests sat bathed in the flattering light of the chandeliers. Instead, he navigated through the maze of tables, heading straight for the back of the restaurant. The whispers followed them like a cold draft. George could feel the eyes burning into his back, the subtle pointing of fingers, the muffled laughter hidden behind crystal wine glasses. He kept his eyes forward, ignoring the blatant disrespect, focusing only on the memory of the friend he was there to honor. Vincent stopped at a small cramped table shoved into a dark corner. It was what the staff called the dead table. It sat directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. Every time a waiter passed through a gust of hot air, carrying the smell of grease and shouting voices would wash over the table. It was a punishment, a deliberate act of isolation meant to make the guests so uncomfortable they would leave of their own accord. Vincent pulled the chair out with a rigid mechanical motion. "Your table, sir. Your waiter will be with you shortly." Without waiting for a response, Vincent turned on his heel and marched back to the front, abandoning George in the shadows. George sat down, placing his Stetson gently on the empty chair across from him. The chair where Elias should have been sitting. He folded his hands on the table and took a deep breath, letting the noise of the kitchen wash over him. He was at peace with the darkness. He did not need their light or their approval. Across the room watching this unfold was Julian. Julian was a waiter who viewed his job not as a service but as a stepping stone. He was fiercely ambitious, incredibly arrogant, and judged his tables entirely by the potential size of the tip. He catered exclusively to the wealthy, laughing too loudly at their jokes, pouring their wine with theatrical flair, and ignoring anyone he deemed beneath his station. When Vincent caught his eye and nodded toward the dark corner by the kitchen, Julian let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He muttered a curse under his breath, adjusting his silk tie before making the long walk toward the back of the room. Julian approached the table without the customary smile he reserved for the elite. He did not offer the leather-bound wine list. He did not introduce himself. He simply pulled a single paper menu from his apron and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft slap sliding slightly across the linen. Water, Julian asked, his tone flat and bored, as if the mere act of speaking to George was draining his life force. George looked at the tossed menu and then up at the young man. He saw the impatience in Julian's eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. "Yes, sir. Just a glass of ice water, please. And I am ready to order whenever you are." Julian pulled a small notepad from his pocket, not bothering to make eye contact. "We usually recommend our guests take time to review the chef's tasting menu, but I suppose you know what you want." "I do," George replied, his voice calm and unbothered. "I would like the ribeye, medium rare. No fancy sauces, just a baked potato on the side if you have it." Julian stopped writing. He slowly lowered his pen and looked at George, a smile of pure, unfiltered mockery forming on his lips. He spoke loudly, intentionally projecting his voice so the guests at the nearest tables could hear. "A baked potato. Sir, this is a Michelin-recognized establishment. We do not serve baked potatoes. We have a delicate potato puree infused with white truffle and bone marrow. If you're looking for a simple steak and potato, perhaps you would feel more comfortable at the diner across the highway. The prices there might be more aligned with your comfort zone." The nearest table, a group of young executives in tailored suits, erupted into soft, suppressed laughter. The humiliation was designed to be sharp, to cut deep and force the unwanted guest out the door. George sat perfectly still. He looked at the young waiter, seeing right through the bravado and the arrogance. He felt a familiar twinge of sorrow, not for himself, but for a world that had become so disconnected from basic human decency. He did not rise to the bait. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked Julian in the eye with a gaze so steady and profound that the young waiter momentarily shifted his weight uncomfortably. "The puree will be just fine, son," George said quietly. "Thank you." Julian scoffed, turning away without another word. He pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, leaving George alone in the dim light. The wait was intentional. George sat in the corner for nearly 45 minutes, while tables that had arrived after him were served their appetizers, their entrees, and their wine. He watched the choreography of the room, the way Julian fawned over a table of wealthy socialites, laughing and pouring champagne, while completely ignoring the dark corner. Every few minutes, the kitchen doors would burst open, hitting the back of George's chair, jarring him forward. The busboys rushed past, carrying heavy trays of dirty dishes, ignoring his empty water glass. It was a systematic stripping of dignity, a silent agreement among the staff that this man did not matter. But George Strait was not a man easily broken by the opinions of strangers. He used the time to pray. He bowed his head slightly, closing his eyes, and thanking God for the life he had been given, for the land he worked, and for the memory of his friend Elias. He found strength in his faith, knowing that the grandest chandeliers in the world could never outshine the simple grace of a humble heart. George pulled his arm back instinctively, the heat of the sauce burning against his wrist. He looked down at the ruined sleeve, and then up at Julian, waiting for the inevitable apology. But the apology never came. Instead of offering a napkin or expressing regret, Julian stood tall, looking down his nose at the seated man. He let out a sharp, annoyed breath, as if George had somehow caused the spill by simply existing in his space. "Before you begin eating," Julian said, his voice loud and carrying an edge of absolute authority, "there is a matter of protocol we need to address." George slowly reached for his cloth napkin, dabbing at the hot sauce on his wrist. "Protocol? Yes," Julian continued, crossing his arms over his chest. "Given the nature of your order, and the fact that you are a first-time guest without a recognizable dining history with us, management requires a form of payment to be secured up front. We have had issues in the past with individuals wandering in, ordering expensive cuts of meat, and finding themselves unable to cover the bill. I am sure you understand. I will need to see a credit card before you take your first bite." The entire section of the restaurant seemed to freeze. The clinking of silverware stopped. The quiet murmurs died down. The sheer audacity of the demand, the blatant discriminatory nature of the request, hung in the air like a thick fog. It was the ultimate insult, the final nail in the coffin of humiliation. They were not just telling him he was unwanted, they were calling him a thief, a beggar who had scraped his way into their palace. George looked at the stain on his shirt. He looked at the beautiful cut of meat on the plate sitting next to the spilled sauce. He thought of Elias, who would have been devastated to be treated this way. The silence stretched tight as a guitar string ready to snap. The weight of the injustice pressed down on the room, an unbearable pressure that demanded a reaction. The heavy silence that followed Julian's demand was not empty. It was filled with the toxic weight of 100 judging eyes and the suffocating arrogance of a room that had long forgotten the meaning of grace. The hot peppercorn sauce continued to seep into the fabric of George's shirt, a dark spreading stain against the crisp white cotton. The physical burn on his wrist was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the profound sorrow he felt for the young man standing before him. George did not see a powerful waiter asserting dominance. He saw a lost soul, a man so consumed by the shallow metrics of wealth that he had completely detached himself from his own humanity. At the adjacent table, the group of young executives had stopped their suppressed laughter. Even they seemed to realize that a line had been crossed. The clinking of crystal wine glasses ceased. The soft jazz playing through the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly felt entirely out of place, a cheerful soundtrack to an act of quiet cruelty. Every patron in the immediate vicinity was watching, waiting for the inevitable explosion. They expected the man in the dusty boots to shout, to demand a manager to throw a fit of righteous indignation. They expected the crude behavior they associated with his appearance. But George Strait was forged in a different fire. He was a man who had spent his life under the vast, endless skies of Texas, where a man's character is measured not by how loud he can yell, but by how much he can endure without losing his soul. He thought of the rolling hills of his ranch, the smell of the sweetgrass after a heavy summer rain, and the honest sweat that coated his brow after a day of mending fences. That world was real. The dirt was real. The pain was real. This restaurant, with its imported marble and its artificial cold air, was nothing but a fragile illusion. George slowly reached into the back pocket of his faded denim jeans. The movement was deliberate and unhurried. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, its edges smoothed by years of use. It was not a designer money clip or a platinum card holder. It was the wallet of a working man. He opened it, revealing no thick stacks of $100 bills, but a simple collection of faded photographs, a few receipts, and a standard credit card. He slipped the card from its slot and placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth right next to the spilled sauce. He did not slide it toward Julian. He simply laid it down, his large calloused hand resting on the table for a moment. "There you go, son," George said, his voice carrying the calm, steady rhythm of a slow-moving river. "I hope that puts your mind at ease. I would hate for the management to worry on my account." Julian stared at the card. A flicker of something resembling hesitation crossed his features, but it was quickly swallowed by his towering pride. He snatched the card from the table with a swift, dismissive motion, not bothering to look at the name printed on the plastic. He simply saw it as a victory, a validation of his superiority. "I will run this at the front to open a tab." Julian sneered, turning on his heel. "Enjoy your meal, sir." As Julian walked away, the tension in the room did not dissipate. It morphed into a thick, uncomfortable awkwardness. The patrons turned back to their meals, but the conversations were hushed, strained. They had witnessed a man being stripped of his dignity, and the sheer stoicism of the victim made them all feel inexplicably guilty. George picked up his fork and knife. The ribeye steak in front of him was beautifully cooked, but the atmosphere had turned the meal to ash in his mouth. He cut a small piece, chewing slowly, tasting nothing. He was not eating for pleasure anymore. He was eating to fulfill a promise. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, picturing Elias sitting across from him. He imagined his old friend's booming laugh, the way Elias would have marveled at the absurdly small portions and the extravagant decor. Elias would have found this whole ordeal hilarious. Elias would have said that the food at the local diner was 100 times better and 1,000 times cheaper. The memory brought a faint, sad smile to George's lips. From the shadows of the kitchen doors, a young figure emerged. It was a busboy, a kid no older than 19, wearing an ill-fitting uniform and carrying a white towel over his arm. His name tag read, Mateo. Mateo had been watching the entire exchange from the kitchen porthole. He had seen the spill, the demand, the utter lack of respect. Unlike Vincent and Julian, Mateo knew what it meant to struggle. He knew what it was like to be judged by the dirt on his shoes. Mateo approached the table with hesitant steps, his eyes darting toward the front of the restaurant to make sure Julian was not watching. He stopped beside George and quickly produced a clean, damp cloth from his apron. "Excuse me, sir," Mateo whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I am so sorry about the spill. Please let me help you with that." George looked up at the young man. He saw the fear in Mateo's eyes, the genuine concern etched across his youthful face. George gently took the damp cloth from the boy's trembling hands. "Thank you, Mateo," George said, reading the name tag. "You are a kind young man. Don't you worry about this old shirt. It has seen much worse than a little gravy." Mateo offered a shy, nervous smile, pouring fresh ice water into George's glass. "If you need anything else, sir, anything at all, please just let me know. I will be right over there." "I appreciate that, son," George replied, his voice warm and sincere. "You are doing a fine job." Mateo hurried back to the kitchen, leaving George to finish his solitary meal. The contrast between the arrogant waiter and the humble busboy was a stark reminder of the duality of human nature. George finished his steak, leaving the extravagant truffle potato puree entirely untouched. He folded his napkin, placing it neatly over the stain on the tablecloth. He was ready to leave, to return to the quiet sanctuary of his ranch, to leave this hollow world behind. But destiny had a different script written for that evening. Just as George was preparing to ask for his receipt, the heavy glass doors at the front of the restaurant swung open with a forceful, dramatic sweep. The shift in the room's energy was instantaneous. It was as if a sudden electric current had been injected into the stagnant air. The soft jazz seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the sharp, commanding sound of purposeful footsteps. A large entourage entered the foyer. 4 men in dark, tailored suits with earpieces moved with military precision, forming a protective barrier around the central figure. The man they were guarding was a legend in the state of Texas. He was a billionaire oil magnate, a philanthropist, and a former governor, a man whose influence stretched from the boardrooms of Houston to the political corridors of Washington. He was a towering figure, with a thick mane of white hair, wearing a custom-made suit that commanded absolute authority. He was the kind of man who did not just enter a room, he took ownership of it. The entire restaurant staff went into a state of sheer panic and overdrive. Vincent, the maitre d', practically sprinted from behind his podium, his rigid posture instantly dissolving into a display of desperate sycophancy. He bowed so deeply, he nearly hit his head on the podium. "Governor, it is an absolute honor to have you grace our establishment this evening." Vincent gushed, his voice trembling with excitement. "We were not expecting you, but we have our finest table in the center of the room, prepared immediately." Julian, who had been loitering near the bar discussing his plans for the weekend with the bartender, dropped everything. He practically shoved another waiter out of the way to get to the front, his face plastered with a wide, artificial smile. He grabbed a bottle of the most expensive vintage champagne from the display, ready to offer it as a tribute to the incoming king. The governor ignored Vincent's outstretched hand. He was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by yes-men and flatterers, and he had developed a deep, profound allergy to absolute falsehood. He looked at Vincent with a mild expression of distaste. He did not care about the center table. He did not care about the crystal chandeliers or the truffle puree. He was exhausted from a week of endless meetings and hollow handshakes. He just wanted a good meal and a moment of peace. "Lead the way," the governor grumbled, waving a hand dismissively. Vincent beamed, turning with a theatrical flourish to guide the most important man in the state to the most visible table in the room. Julian fell into step right behind them, carrying the champagne like a holy relic. The patrons at the surrounding tables sat up straighter, hoping to catch the governor's eye, hoping to be recognized by proximity to power. But as the governor walked through the main dining room, his sharp, piercing eyes scanned the perimeter. He was a man who noticed everything. He noticed the strained smiles of the guests, the nervous sweat on the waiters' brows, the desperate need for validation that permeated the air. And then his gaze swept past the center tables, past the glittering lights, and landed squarely on the dark, cramped corner, right next to the kitchen doors. He stopped, dead in his tracks. The sudden halt of the massive man caused a chain reaction. His security detail stopped abruptly. Vincent, who had been walking backward while talking, nearly tripped over his own polished shoes. Julian froze, the heavy champagne bottle suddenly feeling very awkward in his hands. Governor Vincent stammered, his face pale with confusion. "Is something wrong?" "The table is just right over here, sir." The governor did not hear him. His eyes were locked on the solitary figure sitting in the shadows. He saw the faded denim, the stained pearl snap shirt, the weathered silver belly Stetson resting on the empty chair. To anyone else in the room, it was the attire of a common laborer. But to the governor, it was the undeniable uniform of a true Texas legend. The governor's stern, weathered face suddenly transformed. The hard lines of his jaw softened. His eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered astonishment, and a look of absolute reverence washed over his features. He completely ignored Vincent, pushing past the panicked maitre d' with a massive hand. He stepped away from his security detail, leaving the center of the room, and began walking toward the back corner. The dining room fell into a deathly silence. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The soft jazz seemed to mute itself. Every single pair of eyes in the restaurant followed the governor's path. Vincent and Julian exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Why was the most powerful man in the state walking toward the dead table? Why was he approaching the man they had just spent the last hour humiliating? The heavy footsteps of the governor echoed across the marble floor, growing louder as he approached the swinging kitchen doors. Mateo, the busboy, peeked out from the circular window, his eyes wide with shock. When the governor reached the small, cramped table, he did something that sent a shockwave through the entire establishment. He, a man who commanded armies of executives and politicians, reached up and slowly removed his own custom-made hat. He held it against his chest in a gesture of profound, deep-seated respect. He bowed his head slightly, his broad shoulders dipping in a display of genuine humility. "George Strait, the governor," said, his booming voice echoing through the silent dining room, carrying a raw emotional weight that made the crystal glasses vibrate. "The king himself. Good God Almighty, what is a living icon like you doing hiding in a dark corner like this?" The words hit the room like a physical blow. George Strait. The name hung in the chilled air, echoing off the imported marble, and the crystal chandeliers. It was a name that transcended music. It was a name woven into the very fabric of American culture, a symbol of authenticity, integrity, and undeniable talent. The man sitting in the dark corner, the man with the stained shirt and the dusty boots the man Julian had demanded a credit card from before allowing him to eat a simple steak, was not a lost ranch hand. He was a multi-platinum selling artist, a Hall of Famer, a man whose net worth dwarfed the combined bank accounts of everyone sitting in the VIP section. George looked up from his empty plate. He recognized the governor immediately. They had met years ago at a charity rodeo in San Antonio. George did not gloat. He did not look toward Julian or Vincent to rub his identity in their faces. He simply offered a warm, genuine smile, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made the deep lines on his face crinkle with kindness. "Hello, Governor George," said his voice calm and steady, completely unaffected by the dramatic revelation. "It is good to see you again. I'm just enjoying a quiet meal, remembering an old friend tonight." The governor stepped closer, placing a heavy hand on the edge of George's table. His eyes were shining with an emotion that looked dangerously close to tears. "Remembering a friend," he repeated softly. "Well, God bless him. And God bless you, George. I have been wanting to cross paths with you for over a year now. I never got the chance to tell you in person. When my wife passed away last spring, it was the darkest time of my life. I did not want to leave the house. I did not want to see anyone. But I sat in my study every night and I played your records. Your voice, your words, they pulled me out of a hole I did not think I could climb out of. You saved my life, man. You really did." The raw vulnerability in the governor's voice was staggering. Here was a man of immense power laying his soul bare in the middle of a crowded restaurant, expressing a debt of gratitude that money could never repay. George was deeply moved. He reached out, grasping the governor's hand in a firm, calloused handshake. "I am so sorry for your loss, Governor, and I am humbled by your words. Truly, if the music brought you some peace, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do." While this profound, deeply human exchange was happening in the corner, the rest of the restaurant was experiencing a catastrophic meltdown. The camera of the narrative shifts to Julian. The young waiter was standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, the bottle of vintage champagne slipping dangerously low in his grasp. All the blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a porcelain statue. His heart was hammering against his ribs with the force of a trapped bird. His mind raced back through every single interaction he had just had with the man at the table. He remembered tossing the paper menu onto the table. He remembered mocking the request for a baked potato loudly enough for the entire section to hear. He remembered dropping the plate, spilling the scalding hot sauce onto the man's shirt. And then, with a sickening wave of nausea, he remembered his final act of supreme arrogance. He had demanded a credit card up front, treating a living legend like a common criminal. Julian felt the room spinning. He looked at Vincent, the maitre d', who was gripping the edge of a nearby chair to keep from collapsing. Vincent's perfectly manicured facade had completely shattered. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire career go up in flames. They had not just insulted a wealthy man, they had humiliated a beloved cultural icon in front of the most powerful politician in the state. The governor, still holding his hat against his chest, suddenly noticed the dark, greasy stain on the cuff of George's shirt. His brow furrowed, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the details of the table. He saw the spilled sauce boat. He saw the paper menu. He noticed the absolute terrible location of the table shoved against the swinging kitchen doors. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together in the governor's mind, and the warm reverence in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, terrifying fury. He turned his massive frame slowly, looking back toward the center of the room. His gaze locked onto Julian, who was physically shaking, and then moved to Vincent, who looked like he wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. The air in the restaurant suddenly grew 10 degrees colder. The storm had arrived and there was absolutely nowhere to hide. The governor's eyes narrowed into a terrifying glare that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. He was a man who had built empires, a man who could command respect with a whisper. But right now his silence was deafening. He looked from the dark stain on George's sleeve to the spilled sauce boat and finally to the paper menu carelessly tossed onto the linen. He did not need a confession. The scene told him everything he needed to know about the kind of establishment he had just walked into. The sheer audacity of treating any human being with such blatant disrespect was enough to ignite his temper, but realizing it was George Strait, a man who represented the very soul of their state, pushed him over the edge. He turned his massive frame slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that carried across the dead, silent dining room. "Vincent," the governor said, the name sounding like a death sentence. Vincent, the maitre d', flinched as if he had been physically struck. He took a hesitant step forward, his polished shoes feeling like lead weights. Yes, Governor?" he stammered, his face the color of old parchment. "Where is the general manager of this restaurant?" the governor demanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I want him out here. Now." Vincent swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the back office. He is in his office, sir. I will fetch him immediately." He practically ran, his rigid posture completely forgotten in his desperation to escape the governor's wrath. Julian remained frozen in the middle of the aisle, the heavy bottle of vintage champagne trembling in his hands. He felt the collective stare of every patron in the room boring into him. The young executives who had laughed at his cruel jokes earlier were now looking at him with expressions of profound disgust. He was entirely isolated, a man standing on an island of his own arrogant creation, watching the tidal wave approach. Within seconds, the general manager, a man named Sterling, burst through the office doors. He was adjusting his tie, a frantic, sycophantic smile plastered across his face, entirely unaware of the catastrophic situation unfolding. He hurried toward the governor, ready to offer the finest table, the rarest wines, and his unwavering servitude. "Governor, what an absolute pleasure," Sterling began, extending both hands. "We are deeply honored by your presence. Please, allow me to show you to—" "Cut the nonsense, Sterling," the governor interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. He did not take the offered hands. Instead, he pointed a thick, trembling finger toward the dark corner table. "Do you have any idea who is sitting at that table? Do you have any concept of the profound disrespect that has occurred in your dining room tonight?" Sterling blinked, his smile faltering as he finally looked toward the back of the restaurant. He saw the solitary figure in the faded denim and the weathered Stetson. He saw the spilled sauce. He saw Julian, standing like a condemned man in the aisle. The color drained from Sterling's face as the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He recognized the man immediately. It was not just a wealthy patron, it was a living legend. "Oh my God," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling. "Mr. Strait, I had no idea." "You had no idea," the governor repeated, his tone laced with venomous sarcasm. "Because your staff was too busy judging a man by the dirt on his boots to recognize the gold in his character. I watched your waiter," he gestured sharply toward Julian, "standing in the aisle while this man sat in the dark, shoved next to a kitchen door, wearing a shirt stained with your incompetence. Is this how you treat a Texas icon? Is this the standard of decorum you advertise?" Sterling was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with sheer panic. He turned to Julian, his face twisting into a mask of absolute fury. "Julian, what did you do? What happened here?" Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at George, who was sitting quietly, his hands folded on the table, watching the chaos unfold with a calm, stoic expression. Julian wanted to lie, to make an excuse, to blame it on an accident. But under the piercing gaze of the governor and the silent, overwhelming dignity of the man he had humiliated, his voice failed him. It was George who finally broke the tension. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers or demand retribution. He simply stood up slowly, picking up his cloth napkin and dabbing at the stain on his wrist one last time. His movements were unhurried, commanding the absolute attention of every soul in the room. "It's all right, Governor," George said, his voice a low, steady rumble that instantly calmed the frantic energy of the room. "The young man was just doing his job. He was concerned about the bill. He wanted to make sure a man in a dusty pair of boots could afford a simple steak and a baked potato." He paused, looking directly into Julian's eyes. "He even asked for my credit card before I took my first bite. I suppose it's a new policy for folks who don't quite fit the dress code." The silence that followed was absolute. The revelation of the credit card demand was the final devastating blow. The cruelty of the act, laid bare in the quiet, polite tone of the victim, was staggering. The patrons in the room gasped collectively. The sheer audacity of treating a man of George Strait's stature, or any man for that matter, with such blatant discrimination was unforgivable. Sterling looked like he was going to be physically sick. He turned to Julian, his voice a harsh, trembling hiss. "You demanded a credit card up front? From George Strait?" Julian finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic squeak. I didn't know who he was. He didn't look like... He didn't belong here." "He didn't belong here?" Sterling exploded, completely losing his professional composure. "He is the only person in this room who truly belongs anywhere he damn well pleases. You arrogant, foolish boy. You have disgraced this establishment, you have humiliated a legend, and you have cost me my reputation." Sterling turned to Vincent, who was cowering behind the podium. "And you seated him here, next to the kitchen? You are both a disgrace." The manager took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. He turned back to the governor and then to George, bowing his head in profound apology. "Mr. Strait, I cannot begin to express my deepest, most sincere apologies. This is entirely unacceptable. Your meal is, of course, on the house. We will cover the cost of your clothing. Please allow us to move you to a proper table. We will open our finest bottles of wine. Whatever you desire, it is yours." George looked at the frantic manager, his expression unreadable. He did not smile, but he did not scowl either. He simply picked up his silver belly Stetson from the empty chair, the chair that was meant for Elias. He brushed a speck of dust from the brim, his movements deliberate and calm. "I appreciate the offer, son," George said quietly, "but I didn't come here for free food or fancy wine. I came here to eat a meal in honor of a good friend who thought this place was something special. He was a simple man, a hard-working man. He would have been mighty disappointed to see how you treat folks who don't wear a silk tie." He placed the hat on his head, adjusting the brim slightly. "The steak was fine, but the company leaves a lot to be desired. I think I've had enough of your hospitality for one night." Sterling looked devastated, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The governor, standing tall and imposing, crossed his arms over his chest. "You heard the man, Sterling, and let me make something very clear to you. I will never set foot in this restaurant again, and I will make sure every single person in my circle knows exactly why. You don't judge a man by the label on his collar. You judge him by the content of his character, and tonight your staff showed they have absolutely none." The governor turned to Julian and Vincent, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "If I were you, Sterling, I would clean house, starting right now." Sterling did not hesitate. He turned to the two men, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Vincent, Julian, hand in your aprons. You are both terminated, effective immediately. Get out of my sight." Julian dropped the bottle of vintage champagne. It hit the thick carpet with a dull thud, rolling away under a table. His arrogant facade had completely crumbled, replaced by the crushing reality of his own actions. He had spent his entire career trying to climb the ladder of high society, and in one evening, his own prejudice had thrown him off the top rung. He turned and walked toward the kitchen doors, his head bowed, the weight of his humiliation heavy on his shoulders. Vincent followed silently, a broken man stripped of his perceived superiority. The dining room remained perfectly still, the patrons watching in awed silence as the drama reached its conclusion. But George was not finished. He reached into the back pocket of his faded jeans and pulled out his worn leather wallet. He did not take out the credit card that Julian had so rudely demanded. Instead, he pulled out a thick fold of $100 bills. He did not hand the money to Sterling, nor did he leave it on the table. George looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the staff until he found the one person who had shown him an ounce of humanity. He spotted Matteo, the young busboy, standing near the kitchen doors, his eyes wide with shock and admiration. George walked slowly toward the young man, his boots echoing softly on the marble floor. The entire room watched as the king of country approached the lowest-ranking employee in the establishment. Matteo swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clutched his white towel. "Mr. Strait, sir," he whispered, his voice full of reverence. George stopped in front of the boy, offering a warm, genuine smile. He reached out and pressed the thick fold of bills into Mateo's hand, closing the boy's fingers over the money. It was a tip that easily exceeded the cost of the entire meal, a sum that would change the young man's life for months to come. "How you keep up the good work, Mateo," George said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who knew the value of hard work and a kind heart. "You were the only one in this room who saw a man who needed a glass of water, and you didn't ask for a credit card to pour it. Never lose that kindness, son. It's worth more than all the chandeliers in this place." Mateo looked down at the money, tears welling in his eyes. He looked up at George, completely overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I won't forget this. I promise." "I know you won't," George replied softly. He turned back to the governor, offering a final, respectful nod. "Governor, it was a pleasure. I hope you find some peace tonight." "The pleasure was entirely mine, George," the governor replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Safe travels back to the ranch." George Strait turned and began the long walk toward the front doors. The silence in the room was no longer filled with judgment or tension. It was filled with absolute, profound respect. As he passed the tables, the patrons who had whispered and pointed earlier now lowered their heads. Some even stood up slightly, offering a silent tribute to a man who had just delivered a masterclass in dignity and grace. He pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the warm, humid Texas night. The air outside smelled of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt, a far cry from the sweetgrass of his ranch, but it was honest air. He walked toward his dusty pickup truck, the neon lights of the city reflecting off the chrome bumper. He opened the door, tossing his Stetson onto the passenger seat, right where Elias used to sit. He climbed in, the worn leather of the seat groaning softly under his weight. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a deep, comforting rumble. As he pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the glittering, hollow world of the restaurant behind, George looked up at the night sky. The city lights drowned out most of the stars, but he knew they were there, shining just as brightly as they did over his land. He rested his arm on the open window, feeling the warm wind against his face, a quiet, peaceful smile finally settling on his lips. The debt was paid, the promise was kept, and the truth had spoken louder than any arrogant word ever could.